First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak this evening and present to you regarding climate risks and how to integrate them into strategic decision making. Let me see if I can pop up the screen. If everything is working correctly, you should see now my presentation screen, right?
That's perfect. Yeah, we can see.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Café, for the introduction. As you notice, my Spanish is sadly not up to par, so I'm going to be presenting in English. But what I understood from your introduction, I think you introduced me very well. My name is Twan Possen. I'm currently working for AAA Risk Finance as an investment consultant, principal investment consulting, and I have 15 years experience in the financial sector in various roles and in various companies. And it's a pleasure for me today to talk to you regarding climate risk. To start off, I think, why are we talking about climate, and why it's actually, can we say that climate is currently, as we see it, on the agenda of practically every insurer, but also every institutional investor. And that's because, as it's stated here, it matters for all industry stakeholders. So there is societal pressure. Regulators are becoming more and more aware and taking steps. The board of director and shareholder are aligning their interests, and then from that, also management is actually deemed to take action from that. So if I would first talk you through a bit on these different elements. I think starting from the societal pressure, I think it's really become apparent, and it's really grown stronger, that there is a more and more increased awareness that our current lifestyle, the way we treat our climate is not sustainable into the future, and that there actually is a shift needed and necessary to keep the world livable, and to see also that we ensure a future for our children. And I think where you see that most is first of all, I introduced some news clips here, some recent news clips. But also, if you look from an investor standpoint, and that's actually the picture you see on the bottom left of the screen, you also see that the volume of cash invested in sustainable funds is growing quite rapidly. And I mean, this picture on the bottom left from Morningstar, it only goes until the end of 2019, but this trend has been occurring also in 2020, and even the whole COVID is actually applying extra pressure and making the transition and the change, the necessary change, more forceful. So from a society perspective, there is this changing expectation that also insurance companies, but all institutional investors should take climate change into account and take it seriously. From the other side, you also have the regulators. They are taking more and more action on this as well. Where, at first, I mean, a few years ago, I think other challenges were more pronounced. But over the last couple of years, we have seen that actually the regulators have taken a bigger interest in ESG, in climate, and how to integrate it into their regulatory framework. Just some examples mentioned here, which I will be touching upon later as well. For instance, EIOPA is putting in place the Sustainable Action Plan. You see it in the Solvency II framework, where there is talk about how to integrate it, and also in your Pillar 2 requirements, how to integrate climate risk to perceive the risks and then actually manage the risk that it poses for insurance companies as a whole. Last but not least, in the triangle, you also have the shareholders. So I think looking from a company value, as it mentioned here, it's partly it's intangible. So it's the brand, it's the image you portray to society. There are a lot of companies that look at and portray to be securing your future, looking out for their policyholders. So if climate risk and ESG is not taken into account in their day-to-day operation or in their more strategic operations, that poses quite a reputational risk. And looking at indeed the core purpose of insurance companies, of insurance, so giving long-term protection to their policyholders, that's actually something that's also fully coherent with ESG, because it is a long-term trend, it's a long-term problem that needs to be tackled. All this leads actually to management forced to take action. And that can be done in several ways. So, I mean, the most basic thing is including ESG or including climate risk into more the day-to-day operating models. So looking at greener offices, looking at for electric cars, but it's also seeping into all the more core activities the insurance company undertakes. So looking at the underwriting, and I think what we're more looking at today, also taking it into account in the investment decisions that are being made and will be made going forward. So all that leads to a more and more focused attention on climate, on ESG. And if you look at it from the investment standpoint, is it enough to just go green? So is it right? Of course, it is very important to take it into account, but how can you do it in a smart way that also benefits your investments? Because in the end of the day, the financial performance of the investments is something that's also paramount and should be taken into account, because at the end of the day, you should be able to reimburse or to pay out also the claims of your policyholders. So it should not only be relying on going green and then taking ESG into account, but you should take it into account in also more your strategic decision making. So including it, for instance, into your ALM or your strategic asset allocation studies, and looking really at how ESG could make a difference on that level. That, of course, is something, that's always easier said than done, because it raises a lot of questions. And you need the data, you need tools, you need the capabilities to perform a deeper analysis. And that's what I want to take you through today, how you would be able to do that. So I think in order to make a proper case, I would like to take one step back again and take really a look at why are we looking at these climate risks and what is an important distinction we should be taking into account. And for that, I think that the World Economic Forum provides a perfect starting point. The World Economic Forum every year publishes the Global Risks Report, which is actually just a report in which all the major risks that are perceived by CEOs and other industry stakeholders to be the largest risks faced in the upcoming year. And if we look at the 2020 edition, the 2021 edition will be out, I think, in March, so that we are a bit early in that respect. But if you look at the 2020 edition of the Global Risk Report, you see that in terms of likelihood, which is on the horizontal axis, but also in terms of impact, which is on the vertical axis, that climate risks, which are the green dots, are on top of mind and are, if you look at likelihood, actually all five, the complete top five of risks is related to environmental risks. And even in terms of impact, also 3 out of 5 is of the biggest risk perceived for this year is environmental. And that's a trend that has been going on for a number of years, which is depicted in the graph on the right, because that's just an overview of how the focus shifted from the publication of the Global Risk Report in 2007, which is at the bottom, where you see that most of the risks are concerned with the blue, like the economic risks. And through the years, environmental risks have grown in importance and in interest and focus. But if you look at these risks, it's more to do with actually the physical risks. So if you look at it, it's extreme weather events, it's biodiversity loss, it's natural disasters. So that's really the physical risks. And usually the physical climate risks are risks that that tend to come alive on a very long time horizon. So looking 40, 50, maybe even longer years into the future. And therefore, if you translate that back to your current strategic studies and analysis, which I think in my experience range typically in the 10 to 15 year mark, they tend to have a pretty low impact on this strategic time horizon on the short term. However, in order to avoid these physical risks or mitigate the risks, these physical risks posed to us, it's also necessary that the society as a whole and also the economic world goes into a transition. So we have to make changes to our way of life in order to prevent the physical risks from happening down the line. This transition poses also a number of risks. For instance, if you look at the energy transition, I think that's something that's pretty that's happening as we speak. There are things changing in the way we look at the world and in the way we deal with the world, and that could also have an impact on your investments. And those impacts are actually on the short term. So they could potentially have quite a drastic impact in the short term, and therefore should definitely be integrated into all your strategic analysis and how you invest today. And that's also why we have made a decision to start with looking at the transition risks first, before also taking the physical risks into account, just because the impact is much larger on the short term. Well, how do you start out looking at all these risks? Well, I think, if to quote the Dutch regulator here as well, it's always good to start out small, because ESG, climate risks but ESG as a whole, there are a lot of elements to it. There are a lot of components. There is a lot to do there. And yeah, you can't be expected to do it all at once. So it's beneficial to pick a starting point and start small. We, as AAA Risk Finance, started back in 2017 by focusing solely on the impact of the energy transition by means of a carbon risk scan, in which we helped investors to get insight into the carbon footprint of their portfolio, look at the impact it would have going forward, and how different alternatives to that portfolio or how different allocations could reduce the risks the energy transition translated on the portfolio. And that's, I think, also, again, quoting the Dutch regulator, looking at the energy transition and then looking at climate risks is a natural starting point for looking at the whole spectrum of ESG risks. What we learned by doing this type of analysis for our clients is that is to really get an insight on where the pain actually is in this type of transition scenario. So quantifying the financial risks associated with the transition. What it also learned is that if people are talking about climate risk going forward, it's always quite a doomsday scenario. The most focus is always placed on the negative side of things. However, the economy is quite a resilient animal, quote, quote, and where there are, in effect, indeed, a lot of places where there will be pain due to a transition, there it also opens up the opportunities, new opportunities. So it's also good not only focusing on the risks, but also having an eye on the possible new opportunities that you can adhere to, and that can actually even increase the financial performance of your portfolio. Well, from this carbon risk scan, which was solely looking at the carbon footprint, we took it a step further and morphed that into more a forward-looking scenario analysis with taking these climate risks into account. And I think I put up the graph on the right here. It's from the IPCC. Which actually underlines that if we keep going on the path that we currently are, which is indicated by the blue, light blue line, actually the frequency and the intensity of climate impacts, such as these heat waves and storms, that will only increase in years to come. And so this transition that we actually are already seeing is necessary to get this pathway down. We cannot afford to fail to do this because our current way of life is just not sustainable in that way. And as I mentioned in the introduction, I mean, it's all industry stakeholders are in agreement on this. And I think also the regulatory framework and the regulators are taking action on this. I just put up a quote here from EIOPA from last October. Actually, they have taken steps since. But it also means that regulators are demanding these risks taken into account in strategic scenario analysis and looking at the impact of climate scenarios on your portfolio. Well, then it's always the question, how do you go about this? And I mentioned it before, I mean, some things are more easily said than done, because I think if you are looking at these forward-looking scenario type of analysis, there are quite a few challenges, and as indicated here as well on the screen. I think that first and foremost, climate change is a new, is quote unquote a new phenomenon. So there is no historical data available about the impact of climate change on financial indicators. It's also something that will change, will have a profound and structural change in the economy. So it's not good to just do a backward-looking analysis and base your forward-looking views on that, because then you definitely know that you will fail to incorporate the structure, the changing structure. However, if you go looking for data, there is quite a lot of data available if you go looking on, for instance, a sector or an industry level. Because a lot of industries, a lot of sectors actually have performed their own analysis, their own studies in how climate change probably is probably going to affect them going forward. However, it's not apparent for every industry, so the data is incomplete. Each sector has done its own analysis, so there is fragmentation in the data there, which is quite hard to bring together. So there is a challenge there in the data department. Then, as I talked about, you have to make the distinction between the physical climate risks and the transitional risks, where these physical risks are mostly outside of the ALM and ORSA projection. So you can have the ambition to take them into account. However, as they are risks that will become apparent in 50, 60 years time, on the short horizon, you will find that the impact is actually quite minimal, and the added value of already taking it into account on this short time horizon is quite minimal. Where the benefit lies is with the transition risks. However, that also poses the question: if you take a look at these transition risks and you even have a fair idea of what, for instance, the energy transition is going to mean for electric cars or for the energy sector, how then do you translate that to economic factors? How then do you translate that to asset returns or interest rate levels? So there's a unique challenge there as well. There are basically two ways in which one can go about and do this type of analysis, and how one can arrive at forward-looking climate scenarios and take these climate risks into account in your investment policy. The first one is a top-down approach. That means that you look at macroeconomic data, you judge how the transition risks and how these climate risks will impact the macroeconomic variables, and from there you have a trickle-down effect. You sustain a trickle-down effect towards individual asset classes and maybe even a sector level. The drawback to this type of analysis is that it's not really transparent or transparent how to make this translation from these macroeconomic variables to individual asset classes or interest rates. So you will always need to explain this translation or this impact. You will always need some type of sector level data or industry level data to sustain your assumptions, or otherwise it's quite quickly becoming a black box exercise. The other method you can use to get to these forward-looking scenarios is more a bottom-up approach. As I talked about earlier, there are a lot of studies and scientific material for specific sectors, for specific industries, in how the climate transition will impact them and how they will impact the value chain. If you build in a bottom-up approach, you take all this data, and then from this sector level or this industry level, you go upwards and judge what the impact will be on, for instance, equity prices for that specific sector. And then you aggregate this to a more to a higher level, and eventually also aggregate it into more the macroeconomic analysis. But then you have this bottom-up approach where everything is taken from the scientific data and can be quite, where there is some background and basis on the impacts you see going upwards to the macroeconomic variables. Of course, this means there are challenges here as well. I mean, I mentioned the fragmented data, and sometimes there's even data missing. But compared to a top-down approach, I think it gives you a better understanding and a better reasoning for the resulting scenarios you create. And you might not be surprised, given my explanation, that we favor the latter approach. For this, we have a partnership with a specialized company, Links Analytics, which have a framework that actually has a database of revenue flows between different sectors and regions, and is in that sense able to judge what the impact will be from these different sectors, given their interconnection, upwards to more an equity or a bond level, and from there to the macroeconomic level. And I think if you look at the climate risks in a scenario perspective, there are a number of things, number of key takeaways you have to take into account. First of all, we have divided the risks in two types of risks. So first of all, you have the technology risk, so that there is a technology shock, and on the other hand, you have the policy shock. To start with the latter, what we say there is actually, if governments deem the current speed of the transition or the current ambition level of the climate transition to be too low, to be not ambitious enough, they have the incentive to introduce additional policies to urge and to actually force industries to change and to adapt more to a climate-friendly environment. For our scenarios, we identified this, and we put that into a variable such as the price of CO2 emissions. So we consider that the government could either choose to not or choose to impose a fair price on CO2 emissions, which will have a definite impact on certain sectors and the profitability of certain sectors. On the other hand, you also have the technology aspect. So the climate transition needs new technology. So first of all, it's important, as I stressed before, to say that it's a long-term trend. So it's not something that's going to go away. It's something that will change the structure of the economy. It will change the structure of our financial system permanently going forward. And then it's not only looking at individual companies, it's also looking at how is the value chain impacted. So if we take, for instance, the automotive sector into account. If you look at the automotive sector, constructing a car in itself is not even that polluting. It's an average polluter. However, the end product, the car on the road, is quite high. It is deemed to be quite high in terms of pollution. And so you see that there is new technology coming to the car, for instance, the electric drivetrain instead of the internal combustion engine, which is changing that part of the value chain. However, if we then go back to the producer of the car, they see a shift in their profits as well, and where revenue is taken, because where most automotive manufacturers produce their own internal combustion engines, for electric cars, it's all bought in and it's all third party. So the revenue stream, by increasing the amount of electric cars on the road in its whole value chain, has an impact on the manufacturers as well, and also on third-party suppliers. So that is something that you should take into account in your scenarios as well, because if you don't do this, then you will miss this interlinkage. And finally, I think the bottom-up approach, as I said, taking it from the industry level and looking at what certain sectors are doing and how they are impacted, and then aggregating it, makes it a more unbiased and a more transparent approach to your scenarios. And of course, from these two shocks, this technology shock and this policy shock, everything depends eventually also on how fast is transition happening and what ambition, what do we go for in the transition. And that depends, that has an impact on literally everything. Mentioned here are, for instance, stranded assets. I mean, if the transition, the speed of transition is picked up from how it's currently going, and the ambition level is also heightened, then you will have a lot of stranded assets, for instance, on the balance sheet of oil companies, because there will not be any demand for these oil wells and they have to be written off, and therefore diminishing the profitability of these companies and diminishing the revenue. But yeah, as I said, it's not all doom and gloom, because new technologies are also emerging and new business models are created. So that's something you have to take into account as well. And that as the pressure builds and the speed increases, this will become more apparent as well. Well, that's a lot of talk about how to look at these scenarios. To get a little bit more concrete, I also would take you through a number of these scenarios and how they are actually built up. So what I've placed here is actually two types of forward-looking climate scenarios. The one in the middle, the minimal transition, that's roughly the Paris Agreement that was signed, and how the transition should occur given this Paris Agreement. We know that we're currently lagging on these targets, so it's very much probable that the transition should pick up speed and go more towards the other end, which is in this case quite an extreme speed of transition. And then from this, we look at different industries. So as an example, I put the aviation industry here. If we go into a more extreme scenario, then that will probably be fueled by taxes on fuel, taxes on airline tickets. These will increase to diminish the availability and attractability of these of flights. will, for instance, mean that the short-haul flight, actually there will be less demand, actually no demand, because it will be cheaper to take the train. So the revenue stream from the short-haul flights will quickly dry up. For long-haul flights, there's not an attractive substitute yet, but given the price, etc., there will be less demand. And so also the revenue for the aviation industry under a more extreme scenario will be much less than it is currently. The automotive sector, I already touched upon this. As the percentage of electric cars in our fleet increases, it is more a technology standpoint, and it's more a redistribution of revenue streams. So the profitability and the revenues will be less with the traditional automotive manufacturers, but there will be new industries, new entrants to the market that supply the automotive manufacturers to build these electric cars. And if you look at the energy sector, you see the same thing there. Fossil fuels will become less and less attractive, and wind and solar power will take over. Well, given all these sectoral impacts, this can be translated into these into a scenario analysis, which I've shown here on the right of the screen. So what we see here is three different scenarios going from a average speed, actually just continuing the path that we're currently on, towards a more extreme transition pathway, including governments that think that an additional incentive is needed and therefore throw in a policy shock as well. Yeah, what you see from this, and these are for just three main asset categories: the short-term returns, so think of a typical ORSA horizon of 3 to 5 years. What you see is that if we continue the path that we're currently on, actually in the short term, you don't see that much impact at all. I mean, there is not much pressure. There's not too much pressure from outside to change. Everything is deemed to be solvable in the mid to long term, and companies have quite a lot of time to adapt to new regulations, to new technology, to new business models. So the impact is quite low. However, if we up the speed of the transition and we throw in governments that think a incentive is wanted, then you already see, for instance, on the equity part, that even in the short term, there could be quite a impact on the asset returns you generate here. And I think it's good to stress here that this is a very high level example, and that the impact actually differs from sector to sector. And that's something we highlighted here just to illustrate. I think if you look at this more extreme scenario, maybe not surprisingly, but mostly the energy sector and utilities will be the ones that are hit hardest. So what this tells us as well is, instead of just looking at the strategic picture and aggregating everything on a high level, it's also worth noting that in your strategic asset allocation, you should take note of actually your sector exposure and look at where you are most vulnerable for these climate risks. Having said that, building on looking at just the energy transition, then going through the climate risks, it's also worth noting that ESG includes more than just the E of environmental. We also have the S and we have the G. So as it's a good stepping stone to start your journey, it eventually should culminate into including more than just climate risks into on your portfolio. Because if you just focus on, for instance, the CO2 emissions, it could be that on other indicators of ESG, you miss the mark and are actually underperforming with respect to where you could be. And that's something that's taken into account in the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, which goes much further than just looking at climate. And in the end, I think the end goal should be to integrate these Sustainable Development Goals into your whole investment cycle. So from strategic investment decisions, starting at, for instance, also investment beliefs, and going all the way through to evaluation and monitoring of your ESG profile. We are currently working on a solution that goes this way and takes into account all these Sustainable Development Goals into your investment into the investment cycle. And yeah, as mentioned before, as it's a very broad subject and a very broad risk subject, it's not something you can do alone, and you need specialized expertise. And that's why we teamed up with, for instance, Things Analytics and Norbus, which gives us the opportunity to devise a solution where we can help institutional investors looking at their investment beliefs, looking at ESG, SDG friendly benchmarks for the investment portfolio, incorporating not only the climate risk, but also looking at more more broad ESG related risks into these forward-looking scenarios for strategic decision making, and then go all the way through to monitoring and evaluation, and furthering your ESG profile. But yeah, as said before, I think on this journey, it's good to start small and from there expand further. And that's actually also, I think, the final thing I would like to present to you. So it's first of all good to make this typical distinction between the physical versus transition risks. Although the physical risks are very important and should be not overlooked, I think for the short horizon and purely from the investment side of things, the transition risks are much more urgent to act on, as they are going to be there in the near future. And if you are then looking at your forward-looking analysis, as I mentioned, it's good to start out with a specific focus, with a small focus, then gain experience, gain insight, expand it towards, for instance, really looking at the impact climate risks could have on the organization and the investment portfolio, and eventually start working towards a full integration of SDG into the investment cycle. And that's my main message I would like to give to you this evening.